The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine corridors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte made her way to the main courtyard for her daily riding lesson. At just 9 years old, she had already developed a reputation among the palace staff for her sharp wit and unwavering determination. Unlike many children of her age, Charlotte possessed an unusual ability to read situations and people with remarkable clarity. The royal stables were buzzing with activity when she arrived. Her favorite horse, Moonbeam, was being prepared by Thomas Henderson, a kind-hearted guard who had been with the royal family for over 15 years. Thomas had watched Charlotte grow from a curious toddler into a confident young princess, and their bond had developed naturally over countless riding sessions and quiet conversations about life beyond the palace walls. What Charlotte didn't know was that storm clouds were gathering behind the ornate doors of the palace's administrative offices. 3 senior royal aides had been meeting since dawn, their voices growing more heated with each passing hour. Lady Margaret Ashworth, the chief protocol officer, sat rigidly in her chair as she reviewed a detailed report spread across the mahogany table. "The situation has become untenable," she declared, adjusting her pearl necklace with obvious agitation. "Henderson's influence over the young princess is growing beyond acceptable boundaries. Yesterday she questioned the seating arrangements at the state dinner simply because he mentioned something about treating everyone with equal respect." Sir Reginald Blackwood, the palace communications director, nodded gravely while stirring his tea with mechanical precision. "The child is becoming too familiar with the staff. She spent 20 minutes discussing politics with a gardener last week, asking him about his opinions on various social issues. This kind of behavior could damage the monarchy's carefully maintained image." The third aide, Mrs. Victoria Thornfield, the head of royal education, tapped her fountain pen against her leather portfolio. "Henderson has been filling her head with ideas about fairness and justice that are frankly inappropriate for someone of her position. She actually asked me why some people live in poverty, while others have multiple palaces. These are not questions a princess should be concerning herself with at such a young age." Lady Ashworth's expression hardened as she recalled another incident. Last month, she insisted on personally thanking every kitchen staff member after a family gathering. When I tried to redirect her attention to more suitable activities, she asked me why their hard work shouldn't be acknowledged. Henderson was standing nearby, smiling approvingly. His influence is unmistakable. The 3 aides had spent weeks documenting what they considered Henderson's overreach. They had noticed how Charlotte's confidence had grown under his gentle guidance, how she had begun asking thoughtful questions about the world around her, and how she had started treating all palace staff with genuine warmth and respect. To them, these developments represented a dangerous departure from traditional royal protocols. "The solution is clear," Sir Blackwood announced, closing his leather-bound notebook with a definitive snap. "Henderson must be transferred to a different assignment, preferably one that involves minimal contact with any members of the royal family. We cannot allow this contamination of proper royal thinking to continue." Mrs. Thornfield leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We must act quickly and discreetly. If we present this as a routine staffing adjustment, there should be minimal resistance. The princess will adapt to a new instructor within a few weeks, and we can begin the process of correcting the inappropriate ideas he has introduced." Meanwhile, in the stables, Charlotte was having the time of her life. Thomas had just finished explaining the importance of patience when working with animals, using it as a metaphor for understanding people with different backgrounds and perspectives. His stories always seemed to contain deeper lessons about kindness, empathy, and the value of treating others with dignity regardless of their social position. "You know, Princess," Thomas said as he adjusted Moonbeam's saddle, "the most important thing about being in a position of privilege is remembering that it comes with responsibility. Your ancestors who are remembered most fondly are those who use their power to help others and make the world a little bit better." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, her young mind absorbing not just the words but the genuine care behind them. She had noticed that Thomas never talked down to her or treated her like a fragile ornament. Instead, he spoke to her as an intelligent person capable of understanding complex ideas and making her own moral decisions. As they walked Moonbeam around the courtyard, neither Charlotte nor Thomas had any idea that their time together was about to come to an abrupt end. The 3 aides had already drafted the transfer papers, scheduled a meeting with the head of palace security, and begun identifying a replacement instructor who would focus solely on technical writing skills, without any of the philosophical discussions that had become Thomas's trademark. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Charlotte reluctantly ended her writing session and headed back toward the palace. She waved goodbye to Thomas, promising to see him the next morning for another lesson. Her mind was full of the stories he had shared about courage, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it might be difficult or unpopular. Little did she know that these very lessons were about to be put to the ultimate test, and that her response would shock everyone who thought they understood the quiet determination that lay beneath her gentle exterior. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Kensington Palace. Charlotte bounded down the grand staircase, her riding boots clicking against the marble steps as she made her way toward the stables. She had been looking forward to this day because Thomas had promised to teach her about jumping techniques, something she had been eager to learn for weeks. However, as she approached the stable entrance, she noticed something was different. Instead of Thomas's familiar figure preparing Moonbeam, she saw a stern-looking man in an impeccably pressed uniform, standing rigidly beside her horse. His posture was military precise, and his expression suggested that smiling was not part of his job description. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," the man said with a formal bow that felt cold and mechanical. "I am Colonel Frederick Hartwell, your new riding instructor. Please prepare yourself for today's lesson, which will focus exclusively on proper mounting techniques and basic posture correction." Charlotte stopped in her tracks, confusion evident on her young face. "Where is Thomas?" she asked, looking around the stable area as if he might appear from behind one of the wooden posts. "He's supposed to be here. We were going to work on jumping today." Colonel Hartwell's expression remained unchanged as he delivered his rehearsed response. "Mr. Henderson has been reassigned to other duties within the palace. You will be working with me from now on. I expect complete attention and absolute adherence to proper riding protocols. We will not be engaging in unnecessary conversation during our sessions." The young princess felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something about this sudden change felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what was bothering her. Thomas had never mentioned anything about leaving, and just yesterday he had been excitedly planning their upcoming lessons. The abrupt transition seemed deliberately orchestrated rather than naturally occurring. Throughout the morning's lesson, Charlotte found herself distracted and unable to concentrate on Colonel Hartwell's rigid instructions. His teaching style was completely different from Thomas's warm, encouraging approach. Instead of explaining the reasoning behind each technique and connecting it to broader life lessons, Hartwell simply barked orders and corrections without any context or encouragement. "Straighten your back, princess. Lower your hands. Keep your heels down. Focus on your form," he commanded in rapid succession, offering no praise when she followed his instructions correctly, and showing obvious impatience when she struggled with new concepts. After the lesson ended, Charlotte made her way back to the palace with a heavy heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's sudden disappearance was not a coincidence. Her young mind began connecting dots that others assumed she was too inexperienced to notice. She had observed how some of the senior staff members seemed uncomfortable with Thomas's friendly relationship with her, and she had noticed their disapproving glances when he shared stories about fairness and kindness. During lunch, Charlotte barely touched her meal as she wrestled with her growing suspicions. Her governess, Miss Elizabeth Pemberton, noticed her unusual quietness and gently inquired about her morning activities. Charlotte's response was carefully measured, as she had learned that being too direct about certain topics could lead to uncomfortable conversations with various palace officials. "My new riding instructor is very different from Thomas," she said diplomatically, testing the waters to see what reaction her comment might generate. "I wonder why Thomas had to leave so suddenly. He seemed happy working here." Miss Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly aware of more details than she was willing to share. "Sometimes staff members are needed in different positions, dear. I'm sure Mr. Henderson is doing important work elsewhere in the palace. Colonel Hartwell has excellent credentials and will provide you with superior technical instruction." The careful way Miss Pemberton avoided eye contact while speaking confirmed Charlotte's suspicions that this reassignment was not as innocent as everyone was pretending. She had spent enough time around palace politics to recognize when adults were being deliberately vague about uncomfortable topics. That afternoon, Charlotte decided to conduct her own investigation. She knew the palace layout better than most people realized, having spent years exploring its numerous corridors, hidden passages, and forgotten alcoves. Her small size and quiet demeanor allowed her to move through the building largely unnoticed, and she had developed an impressive ability to eavesdrop on conversations that adults assumed were private. She made her way to the administrative wing, where she had often seen Lady Ashworth, Sir Blackwood, and Mrs. Thornfield holding their serious meetings. The corridor was lined with heavy wooden doors, most of which remained closed during the day. Charlotte positioned herself in a small alcove behind a decorative pillar, knowing that voices often carried through the old building's ventilation system. Her patience was rewarded when she heard familiar voices emerging from Lady Ashworth's office. The door had been left slightly ajar, and the three aides were discussing their recent success in removing Thomas from his position. Their conversation was filled with self-congratulatory comments about protecting the princess from inappropriate influences and maintaining proper royal protocols. The Henderson situation has been resolved more smoothly than anticipated, Lady Ashworth was saying, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The princess seemed to accept the change without significant protest. Within a few weeks, she will forget all about his misguided attempts to fill her head with democratic ideals. Charlotte felt her cheeks burning with indignation as she listened to the adults casually discussing their manipulation of her life. The realization that Thomas had been deliberately removed because of his kindness and wisdom, rather than any professional inadequacy, filled her with a determination she had never felt before. These people had underestimated her intelligence, her loyalty, and her growing understanding of right and wrong. Charlotte remained hidden in the alcove, her heart pounding as she continued to listen to the conversation that was revealing the true extent of the conspiracy against Thomas. Sir Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the slightly open door, and his words made her blood run cold. The most important aspect of this operation was timing, he was explaining to his colleagues. We needed to act before the princess became too attached to Henderson's unconventional teaching methods. Children her age are impressionable, and we couldn't risk allowing his influence to become permanent. Mrs. Thornfield's laughter had a cruel edge to it as she added, "Did you see how easily she accepted our explanation? She asked a few simple questions but didn't push back when we provided our standard response about staff reassignments. Sometimes I think we overestimate these children's ability to understand complex situations." Charlotte's hands clenched into small fists as she heard herself being discussed, like a naive child who could be easily manipulated. The condescending tone in Mrs. Thornfield's voice was particularly infuriating, because Charlotte had always respected her education coordinator, not realizing that the respect was not mutual. Lady Ashworth's voice took on a more serious tone as she outlined their next steps. We must remain vigilant to ensure that Henderson doesn't attempt to maintain contact with the princess through informal channels. I've already spoken with security about monitoring his activities and limiting his access to areas where he might encounter her accidentally. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the three aides discussing their plans to reshape Charlotte's education, to focus more heavily on traditional royal protocols and less on the kind of critical thinking that Thomas had encouraged. They talked about her as if she were a project to be managed rather than a young person with her own thoughts, feelings, and capacity for moral reasoning. When the meeting finally ended and the aides began preparing to leave, Charlotte quietly made her way back to her private chambers. She needed time to process what she had learned and to decide how she was going to respond to this betrayal. The adults had clearly underestimated her intelligence and her determination, but she knew that any response would need to be carefully planned. Over the next few days, Charlotte became a skilled detective within her own home. She discovered that Thomas had been reassigned to maintenance duties in the palace's storage areas, a position that kept him far from any interaction with the royal family. She learned that Colonel Hartwell had been specifically chosen for his rigid adherence to traditional teaching methods and his complete lack of interest in developing personal relationships with his students. More importantly, she began to understand the broader pattern of control that the senior aides exercised over her daily life. They carefully managed her schedule, her social interactions, and even her exposure to information about the outside world. What she had previously assumed were random decisions about her education and activities were actually part of a deliberate effort to shape her into their vision of what a proper princess should be. The revelation was both heartbreaking and empowering. Charlotte realized that many of the adults she had trusted were more concerned with maintaining their own power and traditional ways of doing things than with her genuine well-being or development. At the same time, she began to understand that she had more agency than anyone had given her credit for, and that she could choose to resist their attempts to control her thinking. During her writing lessons with Colonel Hartwell, Charlotte began to experiment with subtle forms of rebellion. When he barked orders without explanation, she politely asked for the reasoning behind his instructions. When he tried to rush through lessons without allowing time for questions, she deliberately slowed down and requested clarification on points that she actually understood perfectly well. The colonel's frustration was evident, but he couldn't really complain about a student who was asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in learning. Charlotte was being perfectly polite and respectful while simultaneously making it clear that she would not be treated like a mindless automaton who simply followed orders without understanding their purpose. She also began paying closer attention to the other palace staff members, particularly those who had worked with Thomas or who seemed sympathetic to his approach. She noticed that several of the younger guards and maintenance workers would smile warmly when they saw her, and she sensed that they disapproved of the way Thomas had been treated. One afternoon, while walking through a less frequently used corridor, Charlotte encountered James Morrison, a young guard who had often chatted with Thomas during their breaks. James looked uncomfortable when he saw her, clearly uncertain about whether he was supposed to maintain the formal distance that the senior aides preferred. "Hello, James," Charlotte said with deliberate warmth, making it clear that she wanted to maintain their friendly relationship despite the changed circumstances. "How are you today?" James relaxed slightly, his genuine affection for the young princess overriding his concerns about protocol. "I'm doing well, Your Royal Highness. I hope you're adjusting to your new riding instructor without too much difficulty." Charlotte caught the subtle concern in his voice and realized that James, like many other staff members, was aware of what had really happened to Thomas. This knowledge gave her an idea that would eventually develop into the bold plan that would shock everyone who thought they had successfully managed to control her world. "Change can be challenging," she replied diplomatically, "but sometimes it helps us understand what we truly value in life." The mature wisdom in her words surprised James, and he found himself wondering if the senior aides had seriously miscalculated their young princess's capacity for independent thought. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas's mysterious reassignment, and Charlotte had been carefully observing the daily routines and behavioral patterns of everyone around her. Her young mind was working with the precision of a chess player, considering multiple moves ahead as she developed her strategy for addressing the injustice that had been done to her favorite instructor. During this period, she had noticed that the 3 senior aides maintained a very predictable schedule. Every Tuesday morning at precisely 10 o'clock, they held their weekly coordination meeting in Lady Ashworth's office. These meetings typically lasted exactly 1 hour and were considered so routine that they rarely attracted attention from other palace staff members. Charlotte also discovered that her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, would be hosting an important diplomatic reception the following Tuesday. The event would require the attention of most senior staff members, creating what she recognized as the perfect opportunity to implement her plan. The timing would ensure maximum impact while minimizing the possibility of immediate interference from other authority figures. She had been carefully rebuilding relationships with various staff members throughout the palace, paying particular attention to those who had worked closely with Thomas or who seemed sympathetic to his situation. Her approach was subtle but deliberate, and she was pleased to discover that many people were troubled by the way Thomas had been treated. Martha Williams, the head cook, had been particularly receptive to Charlotte's friendly overtures. During one of their conversations, Martha had mentioned how much she missed Thomas's cheerful presence in the kitchen area, where he would often stop to chat with staff members during his breaks. Charlotte learned that Thomas had been universally liked and respected among the working-level employees, making his sudden disappearance even more suspicious to those who knew him well. "He was always asking about our families and remembering little details about our lives," Martha had confided to Charlotte during a visit to the kitchen. "Not many people in positions of authority take the time to treat us like real human beings. Mr. Henderson was different, and we all noticed when he stopped coming around." Charlotte had also discovered that several of the younger guards were particularly upset about Thomas's treatment. They had appreciated his mentorship and guidance, and they felt that his removal was both unfair and politically motivated. This information gave Charlotte confidence that her plan would have supporters among the staff, even if the senior administrators opposed her actions. The weekend before her planned intervention, Charlotte spent considerable time in her private study, carefully crafting the words she would use when confronting the three aides. She knew that she would only have one opportunity to make her case effectively, and she wanted to ensure that her arguments were both logically sound and emotionally compelling. She practiced her speech multiple times, refining her tone and timing until she felt confident that she could deliver her message with the authority and composure that the situation demanded. Charlotte understood that everyone would be watching to see how she handled this confrontation, and she was determined to demonstrate that she was neither naive nor easily manipulated. On Monday evening, Charlotte made a point of having dinner with her parents before their busy diplomatic schedule began. She wanted to gauge their mood and ensure that they were aware of her general well-being. Even though she had no intention of involving them in her planned confrontation with the senior aides. During the meal, her father asked about her writing lessons, giving Charlotte an opportunity to provide a carefully neutral assessment of Colonel Hartwell's teaching methods. She was honest about the differences between her new instructor and Thomas, but she avoided making direct complaints that might prompt her parents to intervene prematurely. Colonel Hartwell is very focused on technical precision, she told her parents diplomatically. His approach is quite different from what I was used to with Thomas, but I'm learning to adapt to various teaching styles. Her mature response impressed both parents, who interpreted her flexibility as evidence that the transition had been successful. That night, Charlotte had difficulty sleeping as she mentally rehearsed the confrontation that would take place the following morning. She felt nervous but also excited about finally having the opportunity to address the injustice that had been bothering her for weeks. She knew that her actions would likely have consequences, but she had decided that standing up for what was right was more important than maintaining the comfortable status quo that the senior aides preferred. Tuesday morning arrived with perfect weather, and Charlotte took this as a positive omen for her planned intervention. She dressed carefully in one of her most formal outfits, understanding that her appearance would contribute to the authority of her message. She wanted the aides to see her as a serious person deserving of respect, not as a child who could be easily dismissed or patronized. At precisely 9:45 a.m., Charlotte positioned herself in the corridor outside Lady Ashworth's office. She could hear voices inside as the three aides began their weekly meeting, discussing various administrative matters with their usual self-satisfied efficiency. Charlotte took several deep breaths, reminding herself of all the reasons why this confrontation was necessary and justified. The sound of confident footsteps approaching the office made Charlotte's heart race as she realized that the moment she had been preparing for was finally at hand. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with royal dignity, and prepared to deliver the speech that would challenge everything the senior aides thought they knew about their young princess. As the office door opened and the three aides prepared to conclude their meeting, none of them had any idea that their carefully constructed plan was about to be dismantled by the very person they had assumed was too young and inexperienced to understand their manipulations. The ornate grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished chiming 10 o'clock when Charlotte stepped forward and knocked firmly on Lady Ashworth's office door. The conversation inside immediately ceased, replaced by a moment of surprised silence before Lady Ashworth's voice called out, with carefully controlled politeness. "Please come in," she said, though her tone suggested she was not expecting any visitors during their private meeting. Time. Charlotte opened the heavy wooden door with calm confidence and entered the room where the three senior aides sat around their polished conference table, their faces displaying various degrees of surprise and mild annoyance at the unexpected interruption. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows created dramatic shadows across the room, giving the scene an almost theatrical quality. "Good morning, Lady Ashworth, Sir Blackwood." "Mrs. Thornfield," Charlotte said with perfect royal protocol, offering each of them a slight nod of acknowledgement. Her voice carried a maturity that immediately caught their attention, though they had not yet grasped the significance of her unannounced visit. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Ashworth replied, rising from her chair with the kind of forced smile that adults often use when they are trying to appear welcoming, while simultaneously feeling irritated. What an unexpected pleasure. How may we assist you this morning? Charlotte closed the door behind her with deliberate precision, the soft click of the latch creating a moment of tension that seemed to fill the entire room. She had practiced this moment numerous times, but actually being in the presence of the three people who had orchestrated Thomas's removal felt more intimidating than she had anticipated. I am here to discuss the recent reassignment of Thomas Henderson, Charlotte announced clearly, her young voice carrying an authority that none of the adults had expected. I believe there are some important matters that need to be addressed regarding this decision. The three aides exchanged quick glances, their surprise evident despite their attempts to maintain professional composure. Sir Blackwood was the first to recover, clearing his throat and assuming what he probably thought was a reassuring tone. My dear Princess, staff reassignments are complex administrative matters that don't really concern members of the royal family. He began condescendingly. These decisions are made based on operational needs that require adult understanding and experience. Charlotte's eyes flashed with barely contained indignation at being addressed like a naive child, but she maintained her composure and continued with her prepared remarks. I understand that you believe I am too young to comprehend administrative decisions, but I think you may be underestimating my ability to recognize injustice when I see it. Mrs. Thornfield leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from surprise to mild concern. Princess Charlotte, I'm afraid there may be some misunderstanding about the circumstances surrounding Mr. Henderson's new assignment. These personnel changes are routine occurrences that happen regularly throughout the palace organization. There is no misunderstanding, Charlotte replied with quiet firmness, her voice growing stronger as she gained confidence in her position. I am aware that Thomas was removed from his position because you disapproved of his teaching methods and his positive influence on my personal development. I know that you were concerned about his encouragement of critical thinking and his emphasis on treating all people with dignity and respect. The room fell into stunned silence as the three aides realized that their young princess had somehow uncovered the real reasons behind Thomas's reassignment. Lady Ashworth's carefully maintained composure began to crack as she struggled to formulate an appropriate response to this unexpected challenge to their authority. Princess, I think perhaps you have been listening to gossip or misinformation from other staff members, Lady Ashworth said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. The decision to reassign Mr. Henderson was based purely on professional considerations and had nothing to do with his teaching methods. Charlotte took a step closer to the conference table, her small figure somehow commanding the attention of all three adults as she prepared to deliver the most important part of her speech. I was present in the corridor outside this office 2 weeks ago when you discussed your successful removal of what you called inappropriate influences from my education. I heard you congratulating each other on protecting me from democratic ideals and critical thinking skills. The color drained from Sir Blackwood's face as he realized that their private conversation had been overheard by the very person they had been discussing. Mrs. Thornfield's mouth opened slightly in shock, while Lady Ashworth's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup in an attempt to maintain some semblance of normal behavior. Furthermore, Charlotte continued, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who knew she held the moral high ground, I am deeply disappointed that you would assume I could be easily manipulated, or that I would simply accept your explanations without questioning their validity. Thomas taught me to think for myself, to ask important questions, and to stand up for what is right, even when it might be difficult or unpopular. The young princess paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room before continuing with what would prove to be the most shocking part of her confrontation. I have spent the past 2 weeks investigating this situation, and I have discovered that your actions were not only unfair to Thomas but also disrespectful to me as a person. Capable of making my own moral judgments, Charlotte's final statement hung in the air like a challenge, and the three senior aides found themselves facing a situation they had never anticipated, and for which they had no prepared response. The child they had assumed was naive and easily controlled had just demonstrated a level of intelligence, determination, and moral courage that left them speechless and uncertain about how to proceed. The silence in Lady Ashworth's office stretched for what felt like an eternity, as the three senior aides struggled to comprehend the situation they now found themselves in. Charlotte stood before them with quiet dignity, waiting for their response while maintaining the composed demeanor that had made her confrontation so effective. Lady Ashworth was the first to attempt a recovery, though her usual confidence had been completely shattered by Charlotte's revelations. "Princess, I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding about our motivations and methods," she began, her voice lacking its typical authority. "Perhaps we should schedule a more appropriate time to discuss these concerns with your parents present." "There will be no need for that," Charlotte replied firmly, her young voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. "I am perfectly capable of handling this matter independently, and I intend to see it resolved today." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Thomas Henderson will be returned to his position as my writing instructor immediately, and Colonel Hartwell will be reassigned to duties more suitable to his particular teaching style." Sir Blackwood finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. "Princess, with all due respect, personnel decisions of this magnitude require approval from much higher levels of authority. We cannot simply reverse administrative assignments based on personal preferences." Charlotte's response demonstrated just how thoroughly she had prepared for this confrontation. "I have already spoken with James Morrison and several other guards who witnessed Thomas's exemplary service and professional conduct. They have confirmed that his removal was based on personal bias rather than performance issues. I have also documented the positive impact of his teaching methods on my educational development." Mrs. Thornfield attempted to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "Even if your observations have some merit, Princess, the proper channels for addressing these concerns would involve formal meetings with appropriate supervision and administrative oversight." "The proper channels," Charlotte replied with a slight smile that held no warmth, "would have been to consult with me before making decisions that directly affected my education and well-being. Since you chose to bypass that courtesy, I have decided to address the matter through more direct means." The young princess then delivered what would later be remembered as the most stunning moment of the entire confrontation. "I want you to understand that my objection to your actions goes far beyond my personal attachment to Thomas. Your behavior represents everything that is wrong with the way some people in positions of power treat those they consider beneath them." She continued with growing intensity, her words carrying the wisdom that Thomas had helped cultivate during their many conversations. "You removed a good man from his position not because he was incompetent, but because he treated me like an intelligent person capable of independent thought. You were threatened by the idea that I might develop my own opinions about fairness, justice, and the proper treatment of all human beings." Lady Ashworth made one final attempt to assert her authority. "Princess Charlotte, these matters are far more complex than you realize. There are protocols and procedures that must be followed to maintain the stability and reputation of the royal household." Charlotte's response would be quoted by palace staff for years to come. "The reputation of the royal household should be built on integrity, compassion, and respect for all people, not on the suppression of critical thinking and the punishment of those who dare to treat others with dignity. If you believe that Thomas's influence was dangerous because he encouraged me to think for myself and care about others, then perhaps it is your understanding of royal responsibility that needs to be examined." The three aides sat in stunned silence as they realized that their young princess had not only outmaneuvered them intellectually but had also exposed the fundamental flaws in their approach to education and leadership. Charlotte had demonstrated a level of moral clarity and strategic thinking that none of them had anticipated. "Here are my terms," Charlotte announced with the confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. "Thomas Henderson will be restored to his position as my writing instructor by tomorrow morning. You will provide him with a formal apology for the unfair treatment he has received. Colonel Hartwell will be reassigned to work with students who might benefit from his more rigid teaching approach." She paused, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Furthermore, any future decisions regarding my education or the staff members who work with me will be discussed with me before they are implemented. I may be young, but I am not powerless, and I will not allow good people to be mistreated simply because they refuse to treat me like a mindless ornament." The most remarkable aspect of Charlotte's victory was not just that she had successfully challenged the authority of three senior palace officials, but that she had done so while maintaining perfect royal protocol and demonstrating the very qualities that Thomas had worked to cultivate in her. She had shown courage, intelligence, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As Charlotte turned to leave the office, she delivered one final statement that would forever change the way the senior staff viewed their young princess. Thomas taught me that true leadership comes from serving others and standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Today I have tried to honor that lesson. I hope that all of you will take some time to consider whether your actions have reflected those same values. The door closed behind her with quiet finality, leaving the three aides to contemplate the complete transformation of their relationship with Princess Charlotte. They had learned in the most direct way possible that they had seriously underestimated the character, intelligence, and determination of the young woman who would one day help lead their nation. By the following morning, Thomas Henderson had been quietly restored to his position, and palace life continued with a new understanding of Princess Charlotte's remarkable strength of character.